Hello everyone, welcome to Psychology Corner. In today's video, I'll be talking about biases. Firstly, let's see what is a bias. A bias is an action of supporting or opposing a particular person or thing in an unfair way because of allowing personal opinions to influence your judgment. Simply, bias is a tendency to prefer one person or thing to another and favor that person or thing. For example, if you are biased towards women, you might hire only women because you feel they make better employees for some gender-related reason. Biases are learned beliefs, opinions, or attitudes that people are unaware of and often reinforce stereotypes. These personal biases are unintentional, automatic, and inbuilt, leading to incorrect judgments. So let's see how to identify a bias. If you notice these, the source may be biased. This first one, heavily opinionated or one-sided. If it relies on unsupported or unconfirmed claims, it is biased. Presents highly selected facts that lead to a certain outcome. Fourth one is pretends to present facts but offers only opinion. Last one is uses extreme or inappropriate language. So if you find these information, the source may be biased. So there are three types of biases. They are information bias, selection bias, and confounding. Today's video, I'll be talking about 10 cognitive biases that would influence our decision making of day-to-day lives. Before that, let's see what is a cognitive bias. Yes, cognitive bias is a systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment. Individuals create their own subjective reality from their perception of input. An individual's construction of reality, not the objective input, may dictate their behavior in the world. These biases are often a result of the brain's attempt to simplify information processing. And also, cognitive biases can lead to perceptual distortion, inaccurate judgment, illogical interpretation, or what is broadly called rationality. So, the first cognitive bias I would like to talk about is anchoring bias. So let's see what are those 10 biases. First one is anchoring bias. Second one is availability heuristic. Third one is confirmation bias. And the fourth one I'll be talking is framing effect. Fifth one is fundamental attribution error. Sixth is loss aversion. Seventh one is hindsight bias. Then overconfidence bias, and then sunk cost bias. And the last one I'm talking about is self-serving bias. Okay, let's move on to the first bias. That is anchoring bias. The first bias would be anchoring bias. So anchoring bias is the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information encountered when decision making. To overcome this bias, it is important to seek out additional information and consider a range of options before making a decision. it's the idea that we use pre-existing data as a reference point for all subsequent data, which can skew our decision making process. For example, if you first see a wallet that costs $1,200, then see a second one that costs $100, you are prone to see the second wallet as cheap. Then another example, if you see a car that costs $85,000 and then another car that costs $30,000, you would be influenced to think the second car is cheap. Whereas if you saw a $5,000 car first and then $30,000 one second, you might think it is very expensive. The second cognitive bias, that is availability heuristic. So in this bias, the definition is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events based on their availability in memory. To overcome this bias, it is important to consider the actual frequency of the event rather than just how easily examples come to mind. So therefore, it is a mental shortcut that relies on immediate examples that come to a given person's mind when evaluating a specific topic, concept, method, or decision. For example, plane crashes can make people afraid of flying. However, the likelihood of dying in a car accident is far higher than dying as a passenger on an airplane. Making a judgment according to past experiences that are most easily recalled, it is available. So here, to completely overcome the use of availability bias, as it often leads to correcting frequency and probability estimate in real life scenarios. However, the potential negative impact of this bias is that it would be consider all relevant data, not just the one that easily come to mind when decision making under certain conditions. In fact, just recognizing the predictable situations where availability biases can misjudge the decisions you make. So the third one is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms one's pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. So to overcome this bias, it is important to actively seek out information that may contradict your beliefs and consider multiple perspectives. A psychological term for the human tendency to only seek out information that supports one position or idea is called this cognitive bias. So it can cause you it causes you to have biases towards your original position, because if you only seek out information that supports one idea, you will only find information that supports that idea. For example, during presidential elections, people tend to seek information that paints the candidates they support in a positive light, while dismissing any information that paints them in a negative light. The fourth one is the framing effect. The framing effect is the tendency to make decisions based on how the options are presented rather than the actual content of the options. So how to overcome this bias? So here it is important to consider the options objectively and consider them in multiple ways. The framing effect is a cognitive bias So in another way, if you say cognitive bias is where people decide on options based on whether the options are presented with positive or negative connotations. For example, as a loss or gain, people tend to avoid risk when positive frame is presented, but seek risks when a negative frame is presented, which the brain makes decisions about information depending upon how the information is presented. So here a set of options are given, and they influence more by the presentation than the substance of the pertinent information. And then we'll go to the fifth one. It is the fundamental attribution error. So here let's see what is the definition. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to attribute other people's behaviors to their inherent characteristics rather than the situation or context. So how to overcome this one? Let's see. To overcome this bias, it is important to consider the context and other factors that may have influenced the behavior. The basic attribution error, sometimes referred to as correspondence bias or the over-attribution effect as well. In other words, people tend to have a cognitive bias that makes them believe that a person's behavior is determined more by the type of a person they are than by the social environmental factors that affect them. So I hope you understood this one as well. So the sixth one I'll be talking is hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is the tendency to overestimate one's availability to have predicted an event after it has occurred. So if I say it again, the hindsight bias is the tendency to overestimate one's ability to have predicted an event after it has occurred. To overcome this bias, it is important to consider all of the information that was available at the time and avoid the temptation to rewrite history. The hindsight bias involves the tendency people have to assume that they knew the outcome of an event after the outcome has already been determined. For example, after attending a baseball game that you think you might insist that you knew the winning team was going to win beforehand. Let's move on to the seventh one, which is loss aversion. So this is the tendency to strongly prefer avoiding losses to acquiring gains. To overcome this bias, it is important to consider the potential beliefs and risks of each option and not let the fear of loss dominate decision making. The pain of losing is psychologically twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining. The loss felt from money or other valuable object can feel worse than gaining the same thing. Here, for example, loss aversion in behavioral economics refer to a phenomenon where real or potential loss is received by individuals as psychologically or emotionally more severe than an equivalent gain. For instance, the pain of losing $100 is often far greater than the joint gain if finding the same amount. So here people would investing a lower return guaranteed investments over more promising investments that carry higher risks. And then let's move on to the eighth one, which is overconfidence bias. Overconfidence bias is the tendency to be more confident in one's beliefs and abilities than in warranted by the evidence. To overcome this bias, it is important to be aware of this tendency and seek out information and feedback that may challenge your beliefs. An example where people overestimate how quickly they can do work and underestimate how long it takes to get things done. Especially for complicated tasks, business people constantly underestimate how long a project will take to complete. And what causes overconfidence bias? Overconfidence bias is often caused and exacerbated by doubt avoidance, constancy avoidance, incentives, denial, believing first and doubting later. So the overconfidence bias is a well-established bias in which people's subjective confidence in his or her judgment is reliably greater than the objective accuracy of those judgments, especially when confidence is relatively high. Let's move on to the ninth one, the before last. So it is the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to continue investing time, money, or other resources into a project or endeavor because of the investments that have already been made, even if it is no longer rational to do so. To overcome this bias, it is important to consider the current situation and future potential rather than the past information. For example, choosing to finish a boring movie because you already paid for the ticket. Let's see another example. Okay, think that you are keeping an incompetent employee on staff rather than replacing them because the company has already invested tens of thousands of dollars training them. In another way, the sunk cost fallacy means that we are making decisions that are irrational and lead to suboptimal outcomes. And then the last cognitive bias and how to overcome that bias. So the last one is self-serving bias. So this is the tendency for people to attribute their success to their own abilities and efforts while attributing their failures to external factors. So here this bias can manifest in a number of ways. What are they? The first one is claiming credit for successes and downplaying the role of other external factors. Blaming others or external factors or failures or mistakes. Exaggerating one's own role in a successful outcome. Underestimating the role of chance or randomness in successful outcomes. So here, this type of cognitive bias can affect an individual's perception of their own abilities and actions. It can also lead to an inflated sense of self-worth and a tendency to make biased decisions and favor oneself. Also, this can be very harmful in situations where objectivity and fairness are important, such as in decision making or problem solving. Cognitive biases can be actually very harmful. So in conclusion, as they can lead to poor decision making and misunderstandings, they can also contribute the maintenance of stereotypes and discrimination. So it is important to be aware of these biases and try to mitigate their influence on our thoughts and actions. So I think today you learned something you didn't know. These are 10 cognitive biases and how to overcome. So let's meet up again in another ecological video.